Aiden Drakov crouched behind a jagged outcrop of stone, his breathing shallow and ragged. His fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon, the sleek alloy of the rifle cool against his palm. Through the dim, smoke-choked air, the distant hum of Zorvath warships reverberated across the battlefield. He could see their enormous silhouettes blocking out the burning orange of the Vela 7 sky, their massive engines sending streaks of heat through the air. The world he had sworn to protect, Vela 7, was on the brink of destruction. The once peaceful colony, surrounded by lush jungles and crystalline rivers, had transformed into a war zone. Alien invaders had reduced its cities to rubble, and now they were closing in on the last human stronghold. Aiden clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of his squad's survival resting on his shoulders. His heart pounded as the Zorvath forces advanced. His team was pinned down, taking fire from multiple angles. The odds were stacked against them. The Zorvath outnumbered them, outgunned them, and yet here he was, still leading, still trying to hold them back. He forced himself to focus, shutting out the nagging doubts in his mind. He couldn't afford to think about the mission he had failed, the lives he had lost. He couldn't afford to remember the time when he had failed to save the ones closest to him. If he let those thoughts take root, they would destroy him. A voice crackled through his earpiece. "Aiden, we need a plan now. The lines are breaking." It was Commander Ray, her voice sharp with the urgency of the moment. "I know," Aiden replied, his voice steady, though his mind was anything but. "We fall back to the west entrance. It's the only way we can hold them off long enough to regroup." Ray hesitated, a brief silence before she responded. "Understood. But you better hope that artifact you're searching for is worth it, Drakov." The artifact. Aiden had heard the rumors too, the legends of an ancient power buried beneath the ruins of the old human city. It was supposed to be the key to humanity's salvation, a relic of an age where humans were not just survivors, but warriors. But right now, that seemed like a distant dream. The battle around him was real, and it was a fight for survival. He turned to his team, his voice commanding. "We move on my mark. Everyone stay low. We hold them off and make it to the entrance. There's no room for mistakes." The soldiers nodded grimly, shifting into position. Aiden could see the fear in their eyes. They were good soldiers, but they weren't gods. No one had prepared them for a war like this, a war against an enemy so far beyond human understanding. The Zorvath warships continued their descent, their enormous shadow blotting out the sun. Aiden exhaled slowly, trying to keep his focus sharp. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a glimmer of movement. "It's now or never." "Now!" he barked, and they sprang into action. The team moved with practiced precision, darting from cover to cover as they made their way toward the western entrance. The Zorvath responded quickly, their weapons unleashing a hail of plasma fire. Explosions tore through the earth, sending dirt and debris flying. "Keep moving," Aiden shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. His mind was racing, calculating each movement, each step they needed to take. His body moved on autopilot, years of training kicking in. But something deep within him, something ancient, something he couldn't quite grasp, seemed to stir. The further they moved into the city, the stronger the feeling became. His senses heightened. It was as if the ground beneath him was alive, as if it were calling out to him. He shook the thought away. There was no time for distractions. The team reached the western entrance, but the Zorvath were right behind them. Aiden's team took cover, firing back, but they were outnumbered, and their ammunition was dwindling fast. Ray was already organizing the group to prepare for a last stand. They would fight until the end, but Aiden couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of impending failure. As the first of the Zorvath ground troops appeared in the distance, Aiden's thoughts raced. He needed that artifact. It was the only chance humanity had left. But even as he thought this, doubt gnawed at him. What if it was a myth? What if the power it promised was a lie? A sudden crash interrupted his thoughts. A blast of energy sent a piece of the stone wall flying, and Aiden instinctively raised his rifle, firing in a burst of controlled shots. His squad returned fire, But the enemy was relentless. His mind kept drifting back to the artifact. He had to believe. It was humanity's last hope. But could he trust in something he didn't fully understand? "Commander," one of his soldiers yelled, pulling him out of his thoughts. "They're flanking us from the right." Aiden swore under his breath and turned to Ray. She was already directing the soldiers, keeping them focused, even in the face of impossible odds. "We're almost out of time." "Fall back to the ruins," Aiden said, his voice hard. "We can't hold them here." The team began their retreat, moving swiftly through the crumbling streets under the smoke-darkened sky. As they made their way deeper into the city, the strange pull in Aiden's chest grew stronger. It was undeniable now. Something was waiting for him. They passed through narrow alleys and debris-strewn roads, reaching the outskirts of the ancient city. The ruins stood like forgotten giants, relics of a lost era. The Zorvath followed, their footsteps a constant echo in the distance. Aiden's breath caught as they rounded a corner, and there it was, the entrance to an underground chamber, partially obscured by collapsed stone. It was the place the legends spoke of. "We found it," Ray whispered, her voice full of awe. Aiden nodded, but his heart pounded in his chest. They had reached the artifact, but the Zorvath were closing in. Time was running out. "Everyone, get ready," he ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "This is humanity's last chance." He reached for the ancient stone door and, with a deep breath, pushed it open. The dark depths inside beckoned, and as he stepped forward, a new sense of purpose washed over him. Whatever awaited inside, Aiden knew one thing for certain. The war had only just begun. Chapter 2: The Lost City. Aiden's boots crunched against the dust-covered stone floor as he stepped deeper into the forgotten ruins beneath Vela 7. The air was thick with the scent of ancient decay, and the distant hum of battle above seemed to fade into an eerie silence, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The underground chamber was far older than anything he had ever encountered. Its walls were etched with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. His squad followed closely behind, their faces grim, weapons ready. The tense atmosphere weighed on them all, but none of them dared speak. The artifact they sought lay somewhere within this labyrinth, and each of them knew that what they were about to uncover could very well decide the fate of humanity. "Stay sharp," Aiden ordered in a low voice. His words felt unnecessary. They had all been through enough combat to know how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. But the unsettling quiet of the ancient ruins had a way of creeping under their skin. Even Aiden, the leader, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ray, his trusted commander, walked beside him, her hand on the hilt of her plasma blade. "You believe in that artifact, don't you?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with a subtle edge of skepticism. Aiden didn't immediately answer. The truth was, he didn't fully believe in the artifact. At least, not the way the legends had described it. But something deep inside him, the same feeling that had stirred within him when he first set foot on Vela 7, told him that this wasn't just a myth. There was something here, something ancient waiting to be unlocked. "I believe we have no choice but to believe," he finally said, his voice low, eyes scanning the walls as they passed ancient columns, their surfaces worn and cracked. "If it can give us a chance against the Zorvath, then it's worth finding." Ray nodded, but she didn't look convinced. "If it's real, we might be the last ones who can use it. What if we awaken something that we can't control?" The question hung in the air, but Aiden pushed it aside. There was no room for doubt. Not now. The Zorvath were coming, and if this artifact was what the old story suggested, it might be humanity's only hope. He pressed on, his eyes set on the path ahead, his thoughts focused on the task. The deeper they ventured into the labyrinth, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls narrowed, forcing them to walk in a single file. Strange markings adorned the stone, intricate and foreign, pulsing faintly with an otherworldly light. It felt like they were walking through the veins of a long-dead creature, its heartbeat still echoing in the stones. "Over there," one of Aiden's soldiers muttered, pointing to a narrow passage to the right. At the end, a large door stood open, flanked by massive stone pillars adorned with similar glowing symbols. "That's it," Aiden said, his pulse quickening as they approached. The door was wider than any typical entrance, crafted for something far larger than humans. They entered cautiously, weapons at the ready, stepping into the vast chamber beyond. The room was enormous, its ceiling high above, lost in the shadows. The air inside was stale, heavy with the weight of centuries of neglect. In the center of the chamber, on a pedestal carved from a single block of obsidian, sat the artifact. It was a large crystalline structure, its surface shimmering in the dim light. The edges seemed to ripple as though the crystal was alive, an energy pulsing through it that Aiden could feel even at a distance. "Is that it?" Ray whispered, all creeping into her voice. Aiden didn't answer immediately. The crystal radiated a strange, almost hypnotic energy. He could feel it pulling at him, beckoning him closer. He knew that this was no ordinary object. It was something far more powerful, far more dangerous. He stepped forward slowly, every instinct screaming at him to be cautious. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to know what it was capable of. His fingers brushed against the cold surface of the pedestal, sending a jolt of energy through his hand. The crystal pulsed in response, sending waves of light flooding the room. The entire chamber seemed to shudder as the crystal's light intensified. The walls around them vibrated, and the air thickened with a growing energy. Aiden's heart raced as the temperature in the room spiked. He stepped back instinctively, but his mind was consumed with a single thought. Asterisk, what if this is it? What if this is humanity's power? Asterisk. "Aiden, what are you doing?" Ray snapped, her voice tense. "We don't know what this thing can do. I have to try," Aiden said, his voice low but steady. "This could be our only chance." He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the crystal. The moment his fingers made contact, a shock of electricity surged through him, overwhelming his senses. The world around him seemed to dissolve, and for a brief moment, he was consumed by light. His mind exploded with images, ancient battles, warriors of unimaginable power, humans standing tall against vast armies of alien invaders. These weren't mere visions. They were memories of a time when humans were far more than they were now. He saw himself, only not as the man he was today. He saw himself as something different, something older, more powerful. He was a leader of warriors, a godlike figure commanding entire fleets, his strength beyond comprehension. The power surged through him, filling every fiber of his being with a strength he had never imagined. The visions faded as quickly as they had come, leaving him gasping for air, his hands still gripping the crystal. His mind reeled from what he had just experienced. This was no mere artifact. It was a conduit, a key to unlocking the dormant power within every human. But at what cost? Aiden, Ray's voice broke through the fog in his mind. "Are you all right?" He pulled his hand away from the crystal, his breath coming in heavy gasps. The chamber was quiet now, the energy in the air still, almost stagnant. I'm fine," he lied, though the truth was that he was far from it. What he had felt, the power, was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The visions, the sensations, they were too real, too overwhelming. But now he understood. The artifact was real, and it was far more than just a weapon. It was a gateway to an untapped potential within humanity, a power buried deep inside them for eons. "This is it," Aiden said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "This is the key. We can win this war. We can defeat the Zorvath." Ray looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And what happens when we unlock all of it? What happens when we're no longer just humans, but something else?" Aiden didn't have an answer for her. All he knew was that humanity's fate was now tied to this crystal. They had no choice but to move forward, to awaken what had been dormant for so long, whether they were ready or not. The war for their survival had just taken a dangerous new turn. He looked at the artifact one last time, the shimmering surface calling to him. It was time to awaken the warriors within. Chapter 3: The Awakening. Aiden stood motionless before the crystal, his hands still trembling from the shock of the visions that had flooded his mind. The chamber was eerily silent, the hum of energy that had filled the air moments ago now gone. The reality of what had just happened began to settle in. The ancient artifact had shown him glimpses of a power deep within humanity, something that had long been forgotten, something they had never fully understood. But what now? He could feel the power in his veins, a raw, untamed force. It was overwhelming, and yet it was as if the power had always been there, waiting to be unlocked. His heart raced with both excitement and fear. This power was too great to ignore. And yet, what if it consumed him? What if it consumed all of them? Aiden, Ray said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. She stepped forward, concern etched across her face. What happened? What did you see? He turned to her, struggling to find the words. His mind was still reeling from the visions, the images of past warriors, the unspoken promises that the artifact seemed to carry. It was too much to explain in a single breath. I saw everything, he said slowly, his voice distant. The humans we were, warriors, gods, leaders of entire galaxies. We were more than this. More than just survivors. This artifact, it's not just a relic. It's a key to unlocking something within us. Something we've forgotten. Ray's brow furrowed. And what does that mean? What does it mean for us now? I don't know, Aiden admitted, rubbing his temples. But I feel it, this power, it's inside me. Inside all of us. If we can tap into it, if we can awaken it, we might stand a chance against the Zorvath. Or it might destroy us, she muttered under her breath, though she tried to keep her voice steady. Aiden met her gaze, his expression hardening. I can't afford to think about that. The Zorvath are coming. We don't have time to hesitate. There was a long pause, the tension in the air thickening. Ray looked at the artifact, her eyes narrowing as she considered the risks. Finally, she spoke. So what's next? Do we start training? Do we begin using this power? I don't know how, Aiden said, shaking his head. I'm not sure how it works. I barely understand what I felt, but I know it's real. It's inside us. We need to figure out how to unlock it, but we need to move quickly. The soldiers in Aiden's squad shifted uneasily. They were close enough to hear the conversation, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. One of them, Lieutenant Kell, spoke up. What are we waiting for? We don't have time to experiment. We need to act. If this power is what we think it is, we use it now. Aiden turned to him, his voice calm but firm. We don't use it blindly. We need control, understanding. We don't know what might happen if we're reckless. We don't have time for caution. Kell shot back, his frustration evident. You saw what's coming. We're already outgunned. This could be our only shot. Aiden's eyes hardened as he met Kell's gaze. He understood the fear driving his lieutenant, but he wasn't willing to throw away the only chance humanity had left. I know the stakes, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I won't gamble with our survival. Not without knowing what this power truly is. Ray, sensing the mounting tension, stepped between them. Aiden's right. We can't afford to act in panic. We'll train, we'll understand it, and then we'll strike. If we don't, we risk becoming the very thing we're trying to fight. There was a heavy silence as the soldiers absorbed her words. Finally, Kell nodded stiffly, though his frustration was far from gone. Understood, sir. Aiden turned back to the artifact, his thoughts churning. He needed to figure out how to awaken this power, how to tap into it without losing control. There was no manual, no instructions, only a crystal and the remnants of an ancient race that had long since vanished. He closed his eyes, focusing on the energy that still pulsed faintly through him. It was raw like a fire burning deep inside, but it was also unsettlingly foreign. This wasn't something he could master in an instant. The warriors of old had taken years, even decades, to refine their abilities. What if he didn't have that time? Let's move out, Aiden said finally, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of urgency. We'll head back to the base. We'll figure out how to control this. And then, we'll make our stand. Back at the base, the atmosphere was tense. The resistance had been holding their own against the Zorvath forces, but only just. The alien invaders were relentless, and their numbers were overwhelming. The humans were running out of time, and Aiden knew it. But there was no turning back now. He had the power of the ancients on his side, or at least he hoped he did. Aiden set up a training room for his squad. The chamber was sparsely lit, the walls covered in old combat training systems, long unused. He looked over at Ray, who was already preparing for the session. "I'm not sure what to expect," Aiden admitted, glancing at her. "We don't even know what this power really is. How can we train for something we don't understand?" Ray gave him a wry smile. "You lead us into battle all the time without knowing every detail. This is no different." Aiden nodded, but the weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. He wasn't just leading them into another fight. He was leading them into an unknown. What if the power they sought wasn't a gift, but a curse? What if, in their desperation, they awakened something they couldn't control? The first test was simple. Aiden had the soldiers run through basic combat drills, but with a twist. They were to tap into whatever latent energy lay within them, however they could. He watched as Kel, ever eager, stepped forward, attempting to summon the power with brute force. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a shout, Kel's muscles visibly tensed, and his eyes widened in shock as his body surged with unnatural strength, sending him crashing through a wall of reinforced stone. "Shit," Kel muttered, standing up slightly dazed. "That's unexpected." Aiden watched in silence. Kel had tapped into something, but it was reckless, uncontrolled. The raw energy was there, but it needed discipline. The squad had only begun to scratch the surface of what was possible. The power inside them was real, but it was dangerous, and if they didn't learn to control it, it would destroy them. "Again," Aiden said, his voice calm but commanding. "This time focus. Control it." The training session continued, and with each passing hour, the soldiers began to show signs of mastery. Tentative, hesitant at first, but real progress nonetheless. They were learning to harness the energy, but it was clear that they still had a long way to go. Aiden stood back, observing his team. The power they were awakening was extraordinary, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They knew, as he did, that the Zorvath were closing in, and they had no idea if the power they were unlocking would be enough to turn the tide. But there was no turning back now. Chapter 4: The Zorvath's Revelation. The tension in the command center was palpable, thick enough to choke anyone who dared step inside. The hum of the machinery, once a familiar background noise, now seemed oppressive, amplifying every thought, every breath. Aiden stood in front of the strategic map, watching as red blips denoted the advancing Zorvath forces. His fingers drummed against the cool surface of the table, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment when he first touched the artifact, when the surge of power had coursed through him. That feeling was still there, pulsing in the back of his mind. But every time he tried to focus on it, it slipped away like sand through his fingers. He had to master it. He had to learn how to control it, how to channel the ancient power buried inside humanity. The Zorvath weren't waiting. They would not give them the luxury of time. "Aiden," Ray's voice broke through his thoughts. She stepped up beside him, eyes scanning the map. "We're running out of options. They're only hours away from launching a full-scale invasion. Our forces can barely hold the perimeter, let alone face down an entire fleet." Aiden nodded, his jaw tight. "I know. I've been tracking their movements. If we don't act soon, we'll be caught off guard. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about something greater." Ray gave him a sharp look. "What exactly does that mean? You've been distant ever since you came back from the ruins. What's going on in that head of yours?" Aiden didn't answer immediately. He didn't have the answers. Not yet. All he knew was that the artifact had shown him something beyond their current understanding, beyond their grasp. He had to find a way to unlock it fully, to unleash humanity's dormant power before it was too late, before the Zorvath destroyed everything. "We need to prepare," he said, his voice steady. "We fight with everything we've got. But there's one more thing we have to do first." Ray didn't say anything, just looked at him, waiting for him to elaborate. "A team is heading out to the Central Command. We're going to confront the Zorvath." Back in the heart of the Zorvath invasion fleet, the Zorvath stood before a massive holographic display, his cold gaze sweeping over the strategy unfolding in front of him. His pale, reptilian features twisted into a thin smile as he surveyed the human defenses. "They fight well," Daros muttered to no one in particular, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "But they fight out of desperation, not strategy. They will fall." The alien warlord's second-in-command, a hulking creature with scaled skin and gleaming white eyes, stepped forward. "Their resistance is more coordinated than we anticipated. They're using advanced technology, something new. We believe it's connected to the artifact they uncovered." The Rose turned, his eyes narrowing. "The artifact? I'd suspected as much. The humans, they've always been resourceful, but they're playing a dangerous game. Do they even understand what they're dealing with?" "No, my lord," the second-in-command replied, "but they're beginning to tap into it. We've intercepted reports of increased power surges in their forces. They're not just ordinary soldiers anymore." Theros' lips curled into a malevolent smile. "Then it's time to end this. If they want to awaken the power of the ancients, I'll show them what true power is." He turned back to the map, tapping a series of commands into the console. A string of coordinates appeared, leading straight to Vela 7's capital. "Deploy the fleet. We won't wait for them to make the first move. They will face us on our terms. And when they do, we will show them that their power is nothing compared to ours." Aiden and his squad were already on their way, moving swiftly through the dense jungle that surrounded the human stronghold. The Zorvath forces were closing in, but Aiden's mind was still far from the battle. His focus was on the Rose, on the alien warlord who had masterminded this invasion. He had to get to the Rose. He had to understand what the Zorvath knew about the artifact, and why they were so determined to wipe out humanity. "What's the plan once we reach the command center?" Ray asked, her voice cutting through Aiden's thoughts. They were moving through thick underbrush now, the sounds of distant combat echoing in the air. "We confront him. We force him to tell us everything about the artifact," Aiden said, his voice hardening. "He knows more than he's letting on. I can feel it." Ray shot him a look. "And if he doesn't talk?" Aiden didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure what would happen if the Roast didn't give them the answers they needed. But something inside him told him that the Roast wouldn't be able to hide the truth much longer. The power of the artifact was awakening within him, and it was only a matter of time before he could harness it fully. They pushed on, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. Aiden's heart raced as they approached the command center. It was surrounded by thick walls, reinforced by advanced alien technology. But Aiden wasn't concerned about the walls. He was focused on the confrontation that was about to unfold. Inside the Zorvath command center, the Roast stood with his arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on the large view screen before him. His fleet was in position, ready to strike. But something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that humanity wasn't as weak as he had initially thought. The door to his command room slid open with a soft hiss, and his second-in-command entered, bowing low. "My lord, the humans are en route. They're headed directly for us." Theros' eyes gleamed with amusement. "Let them come. They will learn that power cannot be earned. It must be taken." He turned toward the door, his eyes narrowing with a cruel determination. "Prepare the final phase of the invasion. If they want to test their newfound power, let them." The doors to the Zorvath command center opened with a hiss as Aiden and his squad stepped inside, weapons raised. The room was cold, sterile, and unervingly quiet. The Roast stood at the far end, his back to them, staring at the massive view screen. "You've come for answers," the Roast said, his voice a low, predatory growl. "But there is nothing you can do. Your world is ours now." Aiden stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with anger. "We're not here to negotiate, the Roast. We're here to stop you." The Roast turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Aiden's with cold disdain. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing more than ants scurrying underfoot. But you are welcome to try." Aiden's heart pounded as he stared down the alien warlord. Something inside him stirred, the power of the artifact whispering in his veins, urging him to act. He clenched his fists, ready to unleash everything he had, to fight with everything humanity had. But the truth was, they didn't yet know the full extent of what they were dealing with. "You've underestimated us," Aiden said, his voice stronger now. And that's your mistake. Theros' lips twisted into a sneer. Then let me show you what happens when you face real power. He raised his hand, and the room seemed to shudder. Aiden felt it, an overwhelming surge of energy, alien and malevolent, pushing against him. But he didn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The battle for Vela 7 was about to begin, and this time, Aiden wasn't alone. The war had come. Aiden could feel it in his bones as the first barrage of Zorvath plasma, fire, tore through the air above them. The skies over Vela 7 were burning with the light of an approaching doom. But this time, the humans wouldn't go quietly. This time, they were ready to fight. This time, Aiden could feel the ancient power stirring within him, more potent than it had ever been before. The Zorvath fleet loomed above the city's skyline, massive ships hanging in the sky like vultures ready to descend. Their descent was swift and brutal, and Aiden could see them through the smoke-filled air, their war machines descending like metal giants onto the battlefield. He felt a surge of adrenaline, but there was something more, something deeper, something primal, reaching up from within. Aiden's fist clenched tightly around his weapon as he led his squad to the front lines. His body was burning with the power he had only just begun to comprehend, a force that seemed to connect him to something far older than he could imagine. As they moved through the ruins of the city, the air thick with the acrid stench of smoke and burning metal, Aiden's mind raced. Asterisk, this is it. This is where we stand or fall. Asterisk. The resistance had gathered their forces, but they were still vastly outnumbered. The Zorvath were relentless, and their weapons were far superior. The human soldiers, however, were not fighting alone anymore. They had something the Zorvath didn't, something that could turn the tide. "We hold the line here," Aiden said, turning to Ray, who stood beside him, her plasma rifle raised and ready. Her eyes met his, filled with the same resolve, the same recognition of what had to be done. "Ready when you are," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We fight for humanity," Aiden said, his voice almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of everything they had come to know in the last few days. They were no longer just defending their homes. They were fighting for something far more significant. He looked at his team. Each of them had felt the stirrings of that ancient power. Each of them had learned, slowly and with caution, how to harness it. Some of them had embraced it with eagerness. Others had hesitated, unsure of the cost. But now, as the Zorvath began their final assault, there was no time for hesitation. Aiden's thoughts flickered back to the moment they had first touched the artifact. The visions, the power, the knowledge that had flooded him, overwhelming yet invigorating. "We are the warriors of old," he thought, gripping his weapon tighter. "And it's time to awaken again. Everyone, on my signal," Aiden ordered, his voice sharp with authority. The air was thick with tension as he watched the Zorvath forces closing in. A signal, a flare from one of the higher points of the city. It was their cue. The flare shot into the sky, an explosive arc of red light. Aiden didn't wait for the signal to fall back down. He was already moving. His legs burned with the power, his senses alive with energy he had never known. They charged into the thick of the battle, weapons blazing, the air lit with streaks of plasma fire and the distant roar of the Zorvath war machines. And then, as if the entire battlefield held its breath, it happened. Aiden felt it. The power that had been growing within him surged like an unstoppable wave. He didn't consciously command it. It simply was. His eyes flashed with a brilliant blue light, an energy that resonated deep within his very being. And in that instant, the world seemed to slow. He reached out, and the ground beneath the Zorvath forces rippled. Energy surged through the earth, and with a single thought, Aiden sent a shockwave tearing through the ground, sending the closest Zorvath war machines careening out of control, crashing into the nearby structures. The soldiers in his squad halted, their mouths agape as they watched the chaos unfold. "Holy!" Ray began, but she was cut off by the sound of another explosion in the distance. "Keep moving," Aiden barked, shaking himself out of the awe of what he had just done. There was no time for hesitation. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew this was only the beginning. The squad pushed forward, and as they did, Aiden's mind began to work, his thoughts clearer than ever. Asterisk control. Focus. Asterisk, this power could not be used recklessly. He needed to think, to channel the force within him with precision. The Zorvath were still out there, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. He spotted a group of Zorvath soldiers pushing through a collapsed building, their weapons aimed directly at the humans advancing toward them. Aiden didn't hesitate. The power surged within him again, but this time he focused it, directing it through his hands, through his chest, through his very core. With a single motion, a beam of raw energy erupted from his palm, incinerating the Zorvath soldiers in an instant. His heart raced, and for a moment, he felt the power surge beyond what he could control. The world around him felt distant, like a dream, but he fought to remain grounded. He couldn't afford to lose himself now, not with everything at stake. Stay focused, Ray shouted from behind him, and her words broke through his reverie. She was right. They couldn't afford to get lost in the power. They needed strategy. Aiden forced himself to calm, to steady his breathing. He looked around. His squad was moving with newfound confidence, each soldier tapping into the power they had awakened within themselves. They were not just surviving anymore, they were fighting back. This was humanity's moment. But just as they made their push forward, the ground beneath them rumbled violently. A massive Zorvath war machine, a tank-like structure twice the size of any human vehicle, barreled toward them, its weapons aimed directly at their position. It fired a torrent of plasma, but the humans were no longer helpless. Aiden didn't wait. He charged forward, his energy flaring. He could feel the power surging in every cell, every fiber of his being. He raised his hand toward the behemoth, focusing with all his might. And as if the earth itself answered his call, the Zorvath war machine lifted off the ground. With a roar, it was hurled backward, crashing into a building with such force that the structure collapsed around it. "Did you see that?" Kel shouted, his eyes wide in disbelief. He was panting, but there was a spark in his gaze now, a spark of something new. "I saw it," Aiden said, his voice tight. "And we need to keep moving." The battle raged on, and every step forward felt like a victory. The Zorvath were relentless, but they were not prepared for what humanity had unlocked. Every human in the resistance had been awakened to their dormant potential, and together they fought as one. Aiden knew they weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time there was hope. Hope that humanity might just have what it took to defeat the Zorvath. Not through force alone, but through unity, strength, and the power that had always been theirs buried deep beneath the surface. The battle for Vela 7 was far from over, but Aiden knew one thing for sure. This time, they would not lose.